For some people, the foundations of modern video games were established with Sony's entrance to the video game market with a CD-based gaming system that succeeded in the mid-1990s. Or perhaps it was the arrival of three-dimensional first-person shooter Doom, which dragged PC games kicking and screaming towards the incoming millennium. Or perhaps go back a step further to the Famicom Nintendo Entertainment in the 1980s, which only reached America and Europe in 1985 and 1986 respectively. Well, I've always had a fascination with the very early consoles that competed with the Famicom, which was one of the first international consoles to establish itself primarily as a gaming machine first and foremost. Compared to many other markets, in the United Kingdom the Nintendo Entertainment System performed particularly poorly, and whilst the Japanese company's juggernaut did well in North America, the delay in shipping it from Japan to Europe meant that many other countries considered it out-of-date technology on arrival. I think that due to the preeminence of American commentators, when this period of history is written, it can appear that the video games industry began with the Famicom's arrival in Western gaming markets. And whilst I can see the through line from that console to the Super Nintendo Entertainment System and the Mega Drive face-off that largely monopolised the video game market in the coming years, worldwide the third generation of video games was a very bitty affair, with many different platforms still competing for supremacy. Whilst in the long run it's possible to look back and see Nintendo emerging as the champions, outside of America that was no by means clear at the time. Beyond the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Master System, there was the Atari consoles, a series of microcomputers such as the Commodore 64, the Thomson MO5, and, in the United Kingdom at least, the best-selling microcomputer was the Zx Spectrum. Clive Sinclair, the man who invented the pocket calculator, had used his fortune to fund a series of further inventions such as the electric vehicle, the Sinclair C5, showing his genius was years, if not decades, ahead of his time. And the Zx Spectrum Microcomputer, it was this last invention that earned him a knighthood for services to British industry, as it fundamentally reshaped the British video game industry forever. It wasn't originally designed to be a gaming machine per se. In fact, Sinclair seemed pretty peeved at the time that his precious microcomputer was being hijacked by gaming enthusiasts when he'd intended it to be a mainstream computer designed to teach people to code. Graphically, whilst it could give a satisfactory colour graphic display, it was optimised for text, meaning there was a foreground colour, a background colour, 2 brightness levels, and the ability to flash. Games had to be specifically designed not to cause a colour clash, whilst the Amstrad and the Commodore machines of the time didn't have this liability. Furthermore, the machine didn't possess a joypad or a controller, being just a keyboard that you plugged into your television. Sinclair was at pains to tell people that this was a cheap, family-friendly computer, not a games console, but it was widely available and it was cheap. So the gamers came in droves, and by and large they adored what they found. From 1982 to 1992, there was a whopping 1,719 games released for the machine, although many of them were unlicensed titles produced for clone machines. Sinclair Research weren't the only company churning out the Spectrum. In fact, other companies around the world began producing clone versions of the machine from Slovakia to Romania to Poland, Russia and far beyond. The original machine was officially discontinued in 1992, but its influence carried on for long after that. It seems amazing that in those waning years, in 1992, the year after the Sega Mega Drive and Super Nintendo Entertainment System had their head-to-head Christmas battle, there was still an army of loyal ZX Spectrum fans despairing that their precious machine was about to be consigned to the history books. Alternative Software, a British developer that had thrived on the budget game sector, knew this, which is why for their current project they had no plans to release their latest games on the platform. They'd received the license for many children's television characters such as Postman Pat, Count Duckula, Fireman Sam, Sooty and the Wombles, and they were particularly excited about their agreement with the BBC to release a video game from the recently cancelled but highly popular television show Doctor Who. Dalek Attack was billed as something of a return of the old franchise, which hadn't been on television for 5 years at this point, and it would shortly be celebrating its 30th anniversary with little more than a documentary and some VHS re-releases to mark the occasion. Dalek Attack was meant to be special, depicting several old incarnations of the character in a pitched battle against his deadliest enemies. Multiple versions were planned, with the Amiga, Atari, Commodore 64 and MS-DOS for all other computer users, with music tracks from the series recreated on the primitive computer sound cards in all their glory. One question asked time and time again is, why have there been so few successful attempts to create a Doctor Who video game? Post the show's 50th anniversary, we have some good standard bearers to point at, from the thematically appropriate puzzle games, fully written adventure experiences, to the deliciously goofy Lego game. That last one aside, all of these have to solve the riddle of how to treat the Doctor, a character who famously doesn't carry weapons. How do you design a game with no combat? Alternative software saw no such problem. Even if he won't carry a gun, he does carry a sonic screwdriver, which, whilst not technically being a gun, is as good as one in some people's books. So, in their new creation, 3 separate incarnations of the Doctor, joined by either Ace or a unit soldier, and at some points K9, team up against Davros and an army of Daleks in a globe-trotting fight across London, Paris, New York, Tokyo, and eventually Skaro. You run, you jump, you climb, and you shoot your way across each of these spaces, finding keycards or other hidden items to unlock doors and allow progression to the next area. Each version of the game was subtly different, as they were programmed by different members of the team, following a storyboard brief from 22-1B software development. But the overall experience was largely the same, and whilst it's clearly primitive by today's standards, this was a pretty good-looking Microsoft DOS Office game for 1992. Good looking, but tough as nails. This, it seems to me, is clearly the thing that Nintendo understood that the rest of the video game industry market was still learning. There are difficulty curves, and then there's just unfair game design. Video games were still evolving to exist in the household, transitioning away from the money-crunching arcade machines designed to devour your wallet. Arcade video games are designed to be played for a few minutes then end, providing a fun and complete experience just in that one moment. Most other video games at the time that followed this model were horrendously short, so instead they opted for high levels of difficulty, expecting players to practice, memorise, and eventually master their individual challenges. That means, whilst the game may be short, it will last for hours and hours as the player improves with each fresh attempt. But Nintendo's games, and some other publishers as well, they weren't at all unique, but they began to stray away from this model. They offered a medium challenge that increased the difficulty slowly, training the players to slowly overcome obstacles. Dalek Attack doesn't do this. Whilst it begins with a nice shoot-'em-up segment through the sewers, the moment you arrive above ground, you're being shot at immediately. It's almost impossible to avoid enemies, impossible not to take damage, and it's hard to fathom what your objectives are at any one point. There are things to enjoy here for fans of the show: enemy designs such as flying Daleks from the comics, movie Dalek designs, and the special weapon from the TV series. But for the average gamer, this is a fairly standard run-and-gun platforming game. However, whether by intention or accident, Alternative Software let slip that they had considered a Zx Spectrum version of the game, but had decided not to work on it due to expected poor sales. What they hadn't anticipated, or perhaps they were hopeful of, we'll never know, is that the specialist computer magazine Zx Sinclair found out about this in May 1993, and it ran a campaign to show Alternative Software that the game deserved a full release on the beloved Zx Spectrum. Presumably they received a decent number of responses because in June the following month, Alternative Software had changed their mind, and they even sent anyone who contacted them a sticker depicting the game's front box art declaring, "I've been exterminated." So, against all the odds, the game was officially dead in May, revived in June, and released in July, to pretty poor reviews. Although it was coded by the same member of the team who designed the superior Microsoft DOS version, the most sophisticated version of the game, due to similarities between the assembly language of the two systems, the limitations of the Zx Spectrum resulted in a very real downgrade of the final game. The number of enemies were reduced, leaving the Robomen, Ogrons, and just one standard Dalek type, and all of the end-level bosses were replaced. Zx Sinclair, after organising the public vote to petition Alternative Software for the game, gave it a measly 56% in their review, claiming that it was a chore to really enjoy yourself in it. Dalek Attack, in a quirk of history, was the last game to be officially licensed for the system, as it was nearly a full year since the machine had been officially discontinued. Clive Sinclair continued working as an inventor for another 25 years on inventions such as bicycles and the wheelchair drive. With the years behind him, he began to look back more fondly on the legacy of the Spectrum, and he was openly supportive of attempts to release retro mini-consoles to bring these ancient games to the modern public's attention. He died in 2021 after a long battle with cancer, leading to an outpouring of love from the industry that built itself quite literally on top of the machines he pioneered. It's said that without the immense popularity of the ZX and the influx of young and hungry gamers and coding experts that came up through the 1980s and 90s, there would not be a video games industry in the UK as we know it today. Some things really are timeless, but I cannot say that Dalek Attack ever will be.